Hi, good morning. It's an absolute privilege to be here. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respect to the elders, both past and present. I want to also acknowledge the world that will exist beyond our lifetimes and the people, animals, and nature that will thrive in it. My name is Aarathi Krishnan. Good morning. How do we serve all of humanity without bringing the inequities of our past into our futures? The world feels really complicated right now. It feels like we keep being taken by surprise. Shocks, conflicts, new complex disasters. If you are feeling like this, it's not necessarily wrong. We are, as experts argue, in the age of a global polycrisis, which essentially means a tangled mess of crises. In the past 3 years alone, we have seen multiple parallel crises manifest, whether that's climate emergencies resulting in extreme heat and out-of-control fires, economic instability, exponential increases in cost of living, political insecurities in Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iran, South Sudan, and many, many other states. If this feels strange, if this feels anxious, or it seems improbable, let me give an example. In early 2022, Pakistan experienced an extremely challenging year. It began on the cusp of sovereign default, with rapidly depleting foreign exchange reserves and skyrocketing inflation that was due to the rising global food and fuel prices amidst Russia's war in Ukraine. The volatile economic situation was worsened by a 60-year record-topping heat wave, with some parts of the country recording temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. Canal beds dried up, and with prohibitive fuel costs preventing people from cooling their homes or workplaces, Pakistanis were collapsing from heat stroke. This extreme event was then compounded by devastating floods that impacted the lives of 33 million Pakistanis. Subsequently, Prime Minister Imran Khan was ousted in a no-confidence vote, setting in motion a chain of political crises. That was just one country, but none of us are exempt. We don't seem to be able to improve things. People continue to be left behind. We assume our policy investments, tinkered with at the sides, are enough to respond to anything that comes our way. But what we are going to be facing in the next decade is not anything we have experienced before at the scale in which we will be experiencing it. We are going to be experiencing compounding, intersecting systemic and existential risks. We are going to be experiencing the types of disasters and devastation at a scale that we haven't yet experienced. We are going to experience the types of wars that bypass our rigidly held principles, our values and rules that not necessarily everybody cares about abiding by. We're going to be experiencing the types of injustices, inhumanity, agony, despair not seen in decades, perpetuating historical systemic oppression that already undergirds so much of humanity today. I want to put forward a hypothesis of what levers, tipping points, tip states into crises, and why it's important to think about this when we're thinking about what is emerging. The first, the fiscal resilience of a state to shock. Can it withstand financially whatever is coming its way? The level of trust between its citizens and policymakers. Do all the people in the state trust its public institutions and governments and the leaders making the decisions they are making? The transparency and resiliency of governance. How fair is it? How accountable is it? How corrupt is it? Usually when one thing gets hit, it could still withstand, it could still recover. But when two or more it's hit, it's very likely that a state will fall into crises. Risks are no longer just one issue. We cannot talk about it in silos. Rather, we must see that they are interconnected, interlinked, and have compounding butterfly effects across the globe. This year, I worked on the UNDP risk report that looked at risks and uncertainties for 2023, and they are all heavily intertwined. The first being the backslide in women's inclusion and participation, disrupting economic growth, preventing the actualization of cohesive societies, and regressing previously secured basic rights and freedom. We seem to be going backwards, not forwards. Decreasing access to natural resources, most notably fresh water, because of the climate crises, governance issues, and rapid urbanization. Agricultural and food shortages, which also impact on health at a time of perma-pandemics and chronic health system capacity challenges. And we saw this particularly during COVID. The global economic slowdown that is leading to cascading impacts in energy dependencies, cost of living, and debt distress. Digital rights and digital governance, including issues of unequal digital access for women and erosion of democracies and truth. Economic anxieties, institutional imbalance, mass class divide, the battle for truth leading to significant trust deficit without a trust safety net. In addition, if we thought that was difficult enough, we have seen new cracks emerge. The rapidly increase in wars and conflict. We're also observing and experiencing a shifting global norms. The principles and rules we signed up to globally post-World War II are fast being thrown aside. Aggressive pushback against geopolitical alliances who we align to on the world stage will matter in the long term. Increasing heat as the new unequalizer. If you cannot afford air conditioning, you cannot afford fans. If you cannot afford clean water, you are gravely at risk. Climate geopolitics, we saw the Tuvalu Australian agreement this month, which is fantastic, but it does beg the question of how is this shifting geopolitical decisions, particularly in our region. And interestingly, the rise of climate-proof cities being promoted as refuge for potential climate migrants. An example of this is in Duluth, Minnesota. I know, right? But who wants to go to Duluth? But hey. Looming larger than just the risks, it's the resultant uncertainty. What do I mean by that? Because we usually consider risks in silos, we design a matrix system to measure impact probability. But when they are interlinking in the way that they are now, our ability to govern them is also generally narrow. And as they intersect, as they're doing today, at the rate it's intersecting, it makes it almost impossible to price it, let alone govern it. And when governance and risk design is designed in narrow streams, then, now as always, the historically oppressed and excluded continue to continue to carry the brunt of impact. It begs an answer to this question: how then might we live? How do we know which decisions to make? Good governance fundamentally means that the laws and policies of the state will keep all of us safe. But assuming that much of what will occur in the decades to come will unfold the way it has historically is folly. Does it really matter, though? Surely we should be designing for anew. But what happens when we design policies that make assumptions of how people really lead their lives? Are the choices we make today resilient enough to match what is emerging? Or are we locking in decisions that don't allow for any kind of shift tomorrow? As an example, in the last 2 years, we saw the devastating impacts of COVID-related policies designed in the West and then transferred without nuance into other countries. Social distancing policies do not work when you are part of the urban poor and live in crowded informal settlements in India, Kenya. Lockdown policies don't work if you are a migrant worker living away from home, your village, and have no way of getting home. Policies designed without truly considering how people actually lead their lives are doomed to only serve a small selection of the population. Merely continuing to react in the immediate after makes assumptions that are often out of touch with the realities of the context we live in. It will fail all of us collectively. The assumptions we make about who will be most impacted, the stereotypes we fall back on who is vulnerable, is very quickly shifting. No longer can we assume that some of us exempt from fragility, because these types of intersecting crises means that all of us will be impacted. And if we don't think through our decisions through its long-term implications, we will leave our future generations behind. This is the burning platform of our time, because our collective actions to date have not secured a flourishing future for the planet or for any of us. We continue to fail in ways that keep poor people poor. We fail in ways that still does not recognize the humanity in all of us based merely on the color of one's skin or our sexual or gender orientation. We have failed to safeguard the planet. We have failed to save the world, make the world more equal, more just, more safe. We have failed not because the challenges were impossible to solve, but because of our collective lethargy and apathy to truly reimagine a completely different status quo. If the most fragile amongst us continue to bear the brunt of unanticipated risk and increased uncertainty, our mutual ability to create norms of freedom, of thriving, fall behind. In clearer terms, if we still do not have the existing structural infrastructure and investments to cope with what is existing now, the future of these risks will most certainly impact our capacity to reduce economic and human vulnerability, and in fact, arguably could increase it. To design anew is a hard endeavor. How can we ensure that the authority in which we make decisions today considers its impact in a future that doesn't yet exist, and yet its impact will resonate in those futures? We cannot any longer rely on static ideas of governance, but we need a much more holistic and adaptive approach that proactively identifies emerging risk, opportunities, and changing tides as the only way in which we can ensure that our policies are fit not just for today, but for tomorrow. More than that, I love her, you should look up her work, it's brilliant. More than that, we must also look at what has gotten us here today. What are the systems in which we all exist? How do they play out in people's experiences, and why? We assume emancipation and liberation through our endeavors, but without a critical understanding of power, of who is deliberately unseen or exploited. Might our work actually paradoxically expose or expand harm on marginalized, minoritized constituents? And are the futures we are chasing merely replicating or reinforcing existing or past inequalities? As an example, research has shown that the technological experiments on refugees are often discriminatory, breach privacy, and endanger lives. Refugees are often left out of conversations around technological development, and like other marginalized communities, they often become guinea pigs on which to test new surveillance tools before bringing them to the wider population. We now know that one of the reasons for grave inequality is due to historic colonialism and how it manifests in agony today. I argue that global systems perpetuate hierarchical, patriarchal, hegemonic views of what development looks like, of what progress looks like, ignoring other worldviews and underlying systemic and structural pillars of inequality and bias. They were developed in imperial systems, meaning based on our colonial legacies of the global North and global South, in a way that allows supremacy, racial hierarchies to go unchallenged and to also thrive. The agonies that our world is facing today didn't happen overnight. It is the result of the shared history of colonialism. And what does this all mean? And I'm just going to put this slide up here because Ruha Benjamin is an amazing author and you should look up her work. She wrote a book called Race Against Technology. And she argues about who and what gets fixed in place to enable progress. What social groups are classified, corralled, coerced, and capitalized upon so others are free to tinker, experiment, and engineer the future. And what does any of this mean? Why is it important for the issues of forced migration? Let me put a few what-if scenarios out. What if, as a result of these future emerging risks, the act of displacing populations becomes increasingly a geopolitical endeavor and increasingly pushing people out of safety in their lands to unsafe territories? What if the global resolutions we have signed up to, collectively get discarded? What if, even with the widespread acceptance of people on the move, states are not fiscally able to support increased population sizes, let alone having the right types of social policies to keep people safe? What if Australians themselves become displaced due to vast amounts of land becoming untenable to live? The practice of anticipation, of foresight, it's not neutral. It is conditioned by our positionality, our cultural values, our economic systems, our capacity for collective imagination. Are we only chasing one idea of what progress looks like? Or do we end up replicating versions of ourselves and the stories we want to tell? Anticipatory approaches and foresight can frame our choices and help choose the pathways ahead of us. However, the more rigid our dependence, the finer the line becomes between foresight seduction and foresight coercion. We end up gently bending our choices, our perspectives, our sense of ourselves to fit into these rigid frames, reducing the breadth of our humanity to those templates that are only designed and understood by a privileged few. We design through our own eyes, and so, whose futures are we building? And what kind of systems can we design that can help ensure just, equitable, safe futures for all? We are experiencing such a period of uncertainty, of pain, of loss of hope. We are almost floating, it feels like, from one shock to another. But just looking for hope is not enough, when what we are fighting for is no less than what Indy Johar calls the structural loss of hope, where the idea of the future becomes a place of worry, pain, and struggle, as if the very idea of the future itself is lost. As Arundhati Roy said early on in the pandemic, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And therein lies the answer of how we create hope. We make the choice to walk through the portal with a collective readiness to imagine a new future. Imagining a new future, designing policies that are fit for those futures, cannot be designed in isolation in ivory towers. The visions of futures we are trying to bring closer to us, the systems and policies we are trying to change, can only be transformed if we understand how we got here, our history shared and collective, and the narratives we tell ourselves. Being inclusive in this way means telling the truth about our past, to ensure we don't design the inequities of those pasts into our futures. Being inclusive in this way means reaching people where they are at and not imposing visions of the world as seen through our own eyes down to the many. The imaginations of the few should not colonize the reimaginations of the many. What we have before us are choices about the types of pathways we want to design, to find new meaning and construct shared purpose, and to build new systems of governance, resource flows, rights, opportunity, and expression, amongst others. Any kind of transformation for social good in the 21st century will only truly be effective if it is a systemic interrogation that does not draw on normative static frameworks and linear methodologies that are designed on out-of-date assumptions. It must tackle and pull out systemic inequality and bias, representative of all peoples and futures and clearly linked to strategic reform. Linearity and hegemony are the crippler of our futures. If these last years have taught us anything, it is how we seek a fundamental transformation of our ways of living and being. If we truly want to break from the shackles of our past, we need new approaches to governance and policy making. I put forward a few factors that might help us based on my experience. We need policy dynamism, policies that are dynamic, that anticipates and is proactive in assessing future threats and directing resources to mitigate associated risk. We need to build in anti-fragility into our policy design and understand what those impacts might be across multiple timelines. What I mean by this is not creating policy that remains static no matter what happens. We must see the whole system in which a truth exists. And arguably, seeing the truth in how it exists is probably more important than that truth itself. We're good at doing impact assessments, but we never do future harms assessments. We must understand and analyze not just the future implications of something, but potential future harms and unintended consequences. Can we move away from magical thinking? Can we stop constructing solutions for problems that we don't yet fully understand or don't even exist? Hope is a radical act. It's what makes us cross seas, skies, take risks, and jump without safety nets when the journey and arrival might endanger safety and might diminish us. We are propelled forward by the hope for a better future for our children, our grandchildren, but hope by itself is not enough. We must translate this hope into action that befits the types of resets we need in the redesign of new commons, values, and wisdoms. This orientation must focus not only on imagining some of our paths anew, but must also deeply examine the barriers that have impeded their translation of outdated values and traditions into policy decisions that dramatically shifts the status quo for all. Crises, from climate emergencies to pandemics to wars, they thrive in the cracks of society, exploiting and exacerbating myriad inequalities. The norms that prioritize the immediate at the expense of the future, including through processes that fail to give equity and justice to the many, serve to perpetuate the inequity and exclusion we seek to address. Anil Dash once wrote, "We are accountable for the communities we create." Extending this further, we are accountable for the futures we create. We cannot absolve ourselves of the responsibilities of the intended and unintended consequences of our actions in the short and long term. If our actions enable negative outcomes down the track for the very populations and people we aim to serve and protect, then our actions are a fallacy in the name of humanitarian principles. Radical alterity is the collective responsibility of all of us, of all actors, to not just expect dehumanizing resilience as a coping mechanism for impacted populations, to just deal with whatever comes their way from the policies and systems we designed on their behalf in their futures, but rather to radically work towards mitigating, designing systems that don't just say we don't leave anyone behind, but rather very intentionally designing through justice, equity, and resistance. We have an opportunity now to repair the breaks in our systems and our social contract and hold our institutions and governments to account. We have an opportunity to collectively contour a global narrative that reimagines not just how we live and work together, but fundamentally shifts the structural pillars of how we serve those that need it the most and each other.
Hello, thank you so much. My name's Sanushka. I'm the director of the Red Cross Global Migration Lab. I'm interested in your points about policy design and the ways in which we need to shape the future. In light of what we could describe as an entrenchment of the inequalities and sort of regression in the context of migration policy more broadly and forced migration in particular, what do you see are the entry points for changing the structures that you describe, for actually encouraging or creating the scenario where people like those in this audience can influence the policy makers and governance structures to respond in the way that you described we need to? Thank you.
Great, thanks, good question. I guess first of all I'll say I'm not here, I don't pretend to have all the answers. I'm reflecting based on my experience. As cynical as this might sound, people don't change because it's the right thing to do. They change because there's an underlying alternative value proposition. What I have experienced is that if we look at how we design, the design process of a policy itself, if we design it intentionally to unearth the impacts on targeted populations, impacted populations, minoritized constituents, and we are able to describe that in a way that demonstrates the risk to institutions that do not act and take action now, it makes people understand that the risk is not just to population X, but a collective risk that is shared. And if we have a responsibility in the space when we're talking about anticipating to funnel down the potential implications to the decision points that mean that it matters to who it is you're trying to influence. And I say this, it sounds easy, it's not, because you really need to understand what are those trigger points for action. What are those trigger points that will really force decision? I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you for that very eloquent and, such a powerful message. Thank you very much. You talk about assumptions of vulnerability, and that's something I've been, sort of struggling with all the time because I'm a former my name is Om Dungal. I'm a former refugee from Bhutan and very well settled in Australia now. One of the things I find is that assumptions of vulnerability, when you even think of a word refugee, there's an underlying definition of refugee as somebody vulnerable. Often refugees spend long, years in refugee camps and develop a lot of resilience and perseverance and hope and desire. And they also have a lot of strengths and passions within them. And that's totally undermined when we design policies and programs, either broader policies or for settlement and other things. So can you share some thoughts around how we could redefine refugees with their strengths, not just their vulnerability? Because during COVID, we found that, there was an assumption that, people refugee background are vulnerable and we need to, help them and support them, etc. But we don't look at what are the learnings that these people bring, what strengths that they have developed when they were living as refugees. So there's a lot of learning from these people. So do you look at, do you see opportunities for, redefining refugees with their strengths and redesigning our policies program based on the people's passion, strengths, and, the perseverance that they bring? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think you answered your own question there, but I think as human beings, we historically have been taught, and it is a conscious process to rethink and reframe our mental models. But so often through what we're taught, what the media shows, what narratives we tell, people that are vulnerable are often seen as brown and black on the other side of the world with their hand held out and flies flying over their face. That is dehumanizing. We reduce the idea of somebody that is fragile, somebody that is experiencing stress or crises at that point in their lives, to a stereotype, maybe because it makes us feel better in whatever positions of privilege or platforms we sit on. But that is an act of colonialism. That is how it pervades our mental models. When we start with that assumption, we assume that anybody in need, whether it's a refugee, whether it's an unhoused person, whether it's someone fleeing domestic violence, is always in the need, standing there with their hands out, waiting for solutions to be offered to them, proffered to them. And lots of organizations, including UNHCR, including ICRC, have really worked on shifting that narrative. And you can start to see it now even in the images that are used to tell stories about refugees. And it's moving away from showing people in their most distressed state to rather a state of dignity. And so when I ask the question, what will it take for all of us to flourish, to thrive? Traditionally in development work, you'd say, well, if we can get them secure livelihoods and they can get a job, blah, 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 everything will be all right. But I'm sorry, if you have to work 3 jobs to put food on the table and send your kids to school, if you have to wear diapers because you cannot go you're working on a factory line and you can't go to the toilet during your working hours, that is not dignified. There is no dignity in that. So instead of saying, let's just give them, multiple jobs, but let's design jobs that give people grace, give us all grace, and in fact collectively allow us to flourish. And the last point I just want to say, the assumptions we make about vulnerability must expand to include us into the mix. There, but for the grace of whatever, it just takes one thing to change circumstances extremely quickly. And when we keep thinking that if we are sat here in a state that seems resilient, safe, and that we cannot end up on the receiving end of crises, we have failed. So I do agree with you, sir. I think it's an extremely important and much needed reframing of our mental models, and certainly it is time for that to happen.
Thank you. Alopila Kefu from the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice. One of the things that we talked about last week in a session on human capital development that I presented on was really understanding what institutions and approaches there are within communities who may be affected that we often overlook when dealing with crises like climate change. And I'm thinking particularly in the Pacific. Pacific has thousands of years of history of living in a region that is difficult to live in. It's a very seductive thing to think about the Pacific as this beautiful place. But in fact, it's a very challenging place to live, and people have lived there for thousands of years and have created institutions and ways of doing things that actually are learnings that could potentially be useful in some of these things, but which are often overlooked because they're thought of as traditional or as not relevant. And I wondered whether you had some thoughts on how we can be more open to some of this thinking and some of these approaches and some of these learnings that have come from millennia of living in these regions. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think community-based organizations and grassroots movements and activists and collective action has always driven, probably in some instances more than states' involvement, the flourishing of communities. And they come together when states do not respond or do not have policies that see people as full human beings or assume that they have answers to everything. We have a lot to learn from Pacific Island communities, from First Nations communities. We did, last year 2 years ago, I worked with an Indigenous academic to map Indigenous protocols and how they relate to the SDGs, because we wanted to shift the dialogue more away from just looking at Indigenous populations in terms of environmental conservation, which is often the narrative that is told, but to actually how Indigenous populations interact with each other, the protocols that designed and how they make decisions, and how they relate to living and non-living beings. And there was so much we could learn from, but we don't draw it. And it comes down to this, I think, fallacy in our minds, what we constitute as evidence. for so long, only quantifiable data or trends, or if it's come from a reputable university, would be considered evidence. But storytelling, narrative, qualitative information, and even in the practice of foresight in my work, I can't just give my decision makers a set of signals based on perceptions, because there's no evidence that makes decision makers feel comfortable to take action, because there's risk to just perceptions. And these are the mental models we have to shift. We have to stop assuming that we, or those that are in positions of, or have platforms of power, have all the answers, because we don't. Obviously we don't. So I do feel there needs a fundamental restructure, a rebalancing about not just assuming let's do diversity and inclusion by bringing a bunch of brown and black people around the table, and that's tokenistic, sorry. But how we actually learn from different groups of people to inform our decision making. And secondly, it requires a high level of humility and kind of stepping off our egos. And the question I would say is, are we ready to decenter ourselves in that process?